Jeff shared a few words with the children about two brothers and a father. I would ask us all to hear these words now about two brothers and a father with a blessing and a challenge. From the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 15. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had two sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them. And a few days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and traveled to a distant country. And there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran out and put his arms around him and kissed him. And then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it upon him. Put a ring on his finger and put sandals on his feet. And get that fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked him, 'What's going on?' He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound.' And then he became angry, and he refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him, but he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. And yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' And then the father said to him, 'Son, you were always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and now has been found.'"
Amen. Thank you. Our second lesson today happens to be the very next parable following the parable of the prodigal son, and that begins with Luke in the 16th chapter, verse 1. Jesus said to his disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought against the manager that to the rich man that this manager was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat. He replied, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal home.'" Let me ask you a funny question. Do you talk to yourself? Who's willing to admit it? I talk to myself. Okay, great crowd. I love you. Now tell me, what do you talk about? Maybe you're not so willing to tell me that. You know, I hear Steve mumbling to himself pretty often, and like he just is now, and I ask him, "What are you talking about?" And he says nothing. Well, I'm going to admit it too. I talk to myself. I talk to myself a lot. In fact, in my whole lifetime, the one person I've talked to the most in my lifetime is me. I'm talking to myself constantly. And sometimes I have the right answers, and sometimes I don't. Well, today we just offered you to ponder two different parables. They're back to back in the Gospel of Luke. But they seem as different from each other as you could possibly imagine. Except for one thing. These parables are famous for being what is called the parables of interior conversation. There's only 6 parables in the Scriptures where interior conversation takes place. What's interior conversation? It's a story of somebody talking to themselves. All 6 parables of somebody talking to themselves is in the Gospel of Luke. It's the only place you're going to find those parables. Why Luke? Was it because Luke was a physician? He was a master of the human arts? That Luke kind of understood how people are? And understood that maybe that talking to oneself is an important part of being human, being the children of God, He recognized, because his job was to be in relationship with people who were suffering and needing help, he recognized what the inside conversation for many of the people he helped was all about. So the Gospel of Luke shares these 6 parables, and the characters in the parables are talking to themselves. And it's all about actual human experience. It's about the stuff we run into on a daily basis in life. We're constantly talking to ourselves about things we encounter, how we are going to deal with something that's about to come our way, how we're going to talk to this person or that person, how we're going to deal with this situation. We do it all the time. But as we look at today's parables, we have to ask ourselves, how can we take these 2 back-to-back parables that are very different from each other and understand them? Well, they first feature characters that are talking to each other, yes. And if you take each parable by itself, it has a completely different object lesson for us to learn from. Take them together, however, and we start asking ourselves questions about, when these characters talk to themselves, what exactly are they saying? So let's break it down. We looked at the prodigal son. We all know this one very well. This is the story about the irresponsible son in the family who goes off on his own with half the inheritance, and he hits the skids. And he hits the skids, he's impoverished, he's suffering, he's doing menial work. He used to live in a wealthy family, wonderful farm. Now he's working for somebody else and he's feeding pigs. And in the middle of telling the story, Jesus says, and when he came to himself, he said. And that's the introduction to the fact that the prodigal son is now going to talk to himself. And the prodigal son basically says, I can get a better deal if I go home. I'm not worthy of going home. I can get a better deal if I go home because I can work for my dad and get a better pay, and I'm going to have a better life than I have now. That was... And so we're listening to this internal conversation of that son, and as we're reading it and we're hearing the son coming to grips with his reality, we jump to the assumption, at least I have many times, jump to the assumption that there's going to be a wondrous reunion. The dad's going to welcome him home with open arms. Well, the internal dialogue that goes on in this parable is really different than the assumptions we might make. We want to paint the rosy picture at the end. But that's not where the son is when he's talking to himself. What he's doing is he's negotiating with himself for survival. He's talking himself into going home, stepping into a lesser place in life so that he can survive. And right as he's talking to himself, he's not sure what the outcome is going to be. He could go home and dad could say, hey, you took half my inheritance, get out of here. Never come back. And we know families where that kind of thing happens. But here's a conversation a young man is having in early life after making a huge mistake, where he's working out his survival. He's working out his own meaning as a son, as a human being. He was coming to himself. Yes, Jesus was right. But the epiphany was still coming. It had not come yet. Now we shift to a completely different parable about the dishonest manager, the guy who's working for a rich man, and he's skimming off the top, whatever he's doing, he's not on the up and up. And he gets in trouble with his boss. And then he comes to himself, although it doesn't say that in the parable, but it's the same kind of dynamic. When the boss confronts him and says, I can't have you be my manager anymore, this guy's thinking to himself, he's talking to himself, well, what am I going to do? I have no other skills. I can't do what they do out there in labor. I won't survive. What am I going to do? And in the process of thinking this through and talking to himself, he comes up with a plan. And it's quite the plan. He goes to the debtors and he has them cut their bill kind of in half or down a little bit so that these debtors will be happy with him. And later on, when he's out of a job, they'll welcome him into their home because he was good to them. That's quite the plan. So he does it. He tells the debtors, cut your bill. Cut your bill. And we can imagine, the manager, the rich man's going to go crazy and the other foot's going to come down. But the rich boss goes to his manager, his ex-manager now, and says, "You're a pretty clever guy." And he commends him for what he was doing. And that doesn't make sense to us. It doesn't, and scholars have struggled with this over time. The scholars who have studied this parable some have thought to themselves, well, maybe he just took off his own fee, because that's how you made money. You worked for somebody, you charged somebody what the boss wanted you to charge, and then you put your fee on top of that. So some scholars say maybe he just took his fee off. Maybe that's what that was. And others say, well, maybe the rich boss maybe the manager just took the interest off and said, just pay the bill, don't pay the interest. But then most scholars say it really is a parable about dishonest outcome. The guy talked to himself, came up with a scheme, and pulled it off. And Jesus' advice seems weird. Jesus says, children of this age are more shrewd than the children of light. Think about that passage for a minute, and think about the world we live in. Is that true or not true? Jesus is making an observation about the world we live in. And from what I have watched, the people of this age are more shrewd than the children of light. And then Jesus says, and make friends with them anyway. But at the end of the parable, the epiphany is still coming. Both parables have an epiphany that's still coming to the people who originally talked to themselves. And the beauty of these stories is this, both of them, the prodigal son and the dishonest manager, who had been talking to themselves about survival, came to a different place. And it wasn't because of them, and it wasn't because they talked to themselves. The prodigal was no more deserving than to be someone who fed pigs. The manager was no more deserving than someone who had just cheated his boss. But out of the internal conversations came something else, something neither one ever considered as a result. Both would discover that they stood worthy of grace. The father told his son he was worthy of grace. The rich boss told his former manager that he was quite shrewd. And it stands to reason that in a world that is predominantly without grace, parables are places for us to identify with those who need it desperately. And here's the good news. People who talk to themselves need grace. And I saw all your hands go up, so it's good news, right? We might identify with those who are silently trying to figure out their struggles in life. We all do that. When we talk to ourselves, we're figuring stuff out. But we also are called to identify with those who surprisingly find grace in life where it isn't expected. Either way, the real coming to ourselves, the real epiphany, is to realize that we're not alone in this journey. We can talk to ourselves, but then whatever's going on inside of ourselves has to come out. It has to be expressed in some way. And we must remind ourselves that we can do that and expect that there will be grace when we start searching for it. For some, it's a surprise that grace is out there waiting for us. For others, it is to realize that we are the grace that someone else needs. It goes both ways. Whether we need the grace ourselves or whether we are the ones to bestow the grace upon someone who's been talking to themselves and doesn't know their way out. So I end with a story about grace. I was in the middle of something in my office this week, and I was deep into it. And the receptionist at the desk rung me at the desk and said, "There's somebody on the phone for you." And, 7 to 8 times out of 10, it's someone asking for help. It happens a lot around here. But this is the strangest ask for help I ever got. There was a person on the other end. He says, "I'm over here at Lee Hospital. And I had a heart attack, and I'm recovering from the heart attack. I'm from Brunswick, Georgia, and I don't have any money to go home, and they're not going to let me leave unless I can get home, and I need money for gas." I'm sitting here in my office thinking, oh, geez, and I mean, a lot of people come to the office, and we have a way to help people who come to the office, but I've never had somebody call me from a hospital room and say, "Come over to my hospital room and give me money." And I just, then I lost the connection, and I thought, oh, thank God. And then he called right back, and the receptionist said, "It's that guy again." And I picked up the phone, and then I came to myself, because I was talking to myself behind my desk. I was thinking, man, I'm busy, and and he explained it all to me again. And we got gift cards in my desk that the deacons give me to help people. And I said, "I'll be right over." And I went to the hospital and went up to his room. There he was. He was dressed. He was packing his thing. He was in his room. And I went up to him. I shook his hand. And I gave him 2 gift cards that would get him gas so he can get home to Brunswick, Georgia. And then he said to me, "I'm a member up at First Presbyterian Church in Brunswick, Georgia." And he mentioned the minister's name. He says, "I'm going to tell him about you." I said, "That's okay. You don't have to." But there was a moment there. He caught me in the middle of something, and I was busy, and he was calling on me to do something I didn't want to do, and I don't usually do. But I went. And it made all the difference. And we shook hands, and I went my way, and he went his. And that's the wonderful, surprising reality of grace at the end of talking to ourselves. Amen. Let us stand and say it.